been closed down, and this was I would say kind of a much smaller interpretation for the collection. And there were some people who just weren't very happy about it. So on the day of the private view, while we were still cleaning the cases, we had a bomb scare phoned in, and we had to move all the press out. We had to all of our last minute kind of little jobs we had to put down. It was cleared up quite quickly, but something that's never happened before or since.
Yeah, it's not something I've experienced. Alice, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm Alice, and I'm the interpretation manager at the National Science and Media Museum. We're part of the Science Museum group. And before that, I was the creative producer at that same museum, but my background typically isn't in museums. So before that, I was actually a partnerships manager for an opera company where I worked commissioning artists and producing projects with different universities, so a bit of a different way in. And I guess the strangest thing, or the thing I didn't expect to do working in exhibitions, was I recently commissioned a vibrating chair, which was one for the books, which no one really saw coming, but it's been very popular. So yeah, that's something I didn't really expect to do in this job.
The nearest is really Dalton Square. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Alice. I was caught thinking, oh, I must try and get to visit that vibrating chair.
I think I've tried that. It was good. It was good.
Yeah, I think Jamie has.
Give us a shout if you need help getting things out of the van quickly.
I think there's a couple of people who maybe haven't muted themselves who aren't on the panel.
Nice.
If you
could
just
pop
that,
in
please.
a job.
Thanks.
Homely, isn't it?
And Amy, where do you work, and what did you not expect to do?
Yeah. I'm Amy Gray, Registrar for Exhibitions and Projects at the Courtauld Gallery in London. I've been working there for about nearly 4 years in a registrarial capacity, but I've been really working on exhibitions for the past sort of year and a half. The most unexpected thing I've had to do is actually during this year, because of the pandemic, we had a touring exhibition out in Japan, which started last September, and it was going to 3 different venues. It started out in Tokyo, and then went to Nagoya, and then was going to Kobe. And the transfer was meant to happen in March, which is obviously when everything kind of hit with the pandemic. We actually did manage to transfer the exhibition. I was meant to fly out there, but unfortunately I couldn't because of the pandemic, but we managed to send 2 staff, and so it was transferred over. But then unfortunately it never managed to open to the public, which was a real shame. And then we had to so it was over 60 some of the world's most famous impressionist artworks back from Japan during a global pandemic, doing everything virtually with an 8-hour time difference. And it was a real logistical kind of challenge, but really interesting. And I learned a lot from doing it. And thankfully, everything came back to London with no condition changes. And it was a real kind of success getting it home. So that's my story.
I'm in awe of the logistical management within that, Amy. I hope you've felt a lot of pride in that. And Polly, how about you?
Hi everyone, I'm Polly, and I'm an interpretation master planning consultant. So I do both master planning and interpretation. I've been freelance this time around for about 3 years, and before that I was the creative programming and interpretation manager at the Tower of London. I've probably been doing a role similar to this for about 20 years, but kind of morphing from a theatre designer to a film designer, finally to an exhibition designer, and that's what led to me doing interpretation. And I think my kind of weirdest experience was standing in the Tower of London moat with however many thousands of ceramic poppies. I should know the number, but it's no longer imprinted on my brain, thankfully, alongside a whole load of beefeaters, and also Barbara Windsor. She rocked up as one of the VIPs for the closing ceremony when the final poppy got planted. And she, even though I'm not really sure she was meant to be part of the closing ceremony, she ended up being part of it. So yeah, that was all quite entertaining, and it was quite amazing because there were just so many people who attended in terms of visitors just thronging around. So to be one of the few people that was actually in the moat as it was unfolding felt quite special. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Actually being at a moment that historians are already writing about, I think is a very unusual experience. So moving on, we've had some great questions submitted by people, and I'm going to try and split this session into sort of two halves, thinking about careers and then practicalities. So to start things off, on a practical note, what advice would you give to someone who's involved in organising an exhibition for the very first time? And Alice, would you like to go?
Yeah, I'll do it. Because I remember being involved for the very first time and thinking I was so out of my depth because I'd come from a really different. And we'll talk about skills, I'm sure, and I knew I had the kind of required skills, but there were so many words being used I didn't understand, so many processes that were kind of being taken for granted. And I went home the first day and I spoke to my friend on the phone and they said, you need to just ask questions. And I think that would be my number one piece of advice, is if you're in there or if you're in the room, just ask the question, because you don't want to kind of waste time or do something incorrectly. But I think people respond really positively to you just honestly saying, oh, actually what you're talking about there, I haven't done this before, or this element is new to me, or this process is new to me. We use a lot of abbreviations, obviously we're all guilty of that, checking out those kinds of things. I think calling people out on that, or pulling people in on that kind of thing is really, really valuable. So I'd say definitely ask questions if it's your first time. I'd also say be easy on yourself. They can be really stressful environments and everyone's up against it, but I think if you're kind to yourself and kind to those around you, you can build a really good team. Exhibitions, I mean, I luckily work in a larger organization, luckily for some reasons, obviously you talk about this in your other panels, but if you are lucky enough to have a team around you, you need to support one another. So I think be that support and ask for the support when you need it too. They would be, I know they're kind of soft. I don't like the term soft skills, but they are the kind of softer skills I think that I'm talking about there, just about teamwork and effort and really just not beating yourself up, because they can turn into very stressful situations very quickly.
Oh, thanks so much, Alice. Yeah, I think being kind to yourself is definitely a theme this week. Amy, what advice would you give with your registrar's hat on?
So from a registrar's point of view, you may be working with lenders who will be giving you their artworks, and really you just need to make sure that you know exactly the kind of conditions that they require. As registrars, we work a lot with conservators to make sure that the artworks are exhibited in a safe way. So just, really, as Alice was saying, asking questions, knowing exactly what the lender is expecting and what your obligation as a borrower is. Working in a team, but really your conservator is your best friend, I would say, and ensuring that the works are safe throughout.
Yeah, absolutely a vote for your conservator being your best friend, I think, at all times, but particularly with exhibitions. And I think it'd be good now to sort of talk about kind of the stages in exhibition production. And we had quite a lot of questions submitted about this. So how do you go from a blue sky idea that may or may not be yours to something that you can open the doors to the public to? In a nutshell, I should add. And Polly, would you like to start with that?
Sure. In a nutshell, I'd say very slowly and over usually quite a long period of time, and in successive workshops. So, and it's kind of building a little bit on the previous question. I probably always start with making sure I know who the target audience is and agreeing that with whoever I'm working with, because unless you know like who's going to be the main visitor you're aiming it at, you can't really tell what type of exhibition you're creating. And then it's like slowly trying to work out what the story is you're trying to tell and what the assets are, because they may be objects, but they might be anything from sound to interviews to, you know, you name it. It could be working with an artist. So it's like working out what you're trying to communicate, and then gradually refining that until you end up with your final kind of plan of your exhibition. So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
I love it. I love the focus on time as well. Again, another theme that we've talked on in other sessions, or the lack thereof. Jamie, kind of how's your view on the progression as well?
Yeah, so I kind of echo that it's a really iterative process. But I would say that it's really good to actually be clear about the process, to be clear about that process that you're following. So the process, for example, that I'm most familiar with following is the REBA project management system, which is a very kind of iterative process, and being able to sort of work through and stick to that. I guess kind of in a nutshell, again, that's very much about kind of scoping a project, looking at what resources you need, looking at not just your kind of audience needs, but also some of those kind of more strategic needs as well, which, you know, those needs can kind of overlap and should really. Bringing your team together, doing your research brief, putting that together. From an interpretation point of view, it's looking at some of those key messages as well and testing out some of those key messages and themes, getting your object long list together, getting your best friend the conservator in as well to look at those and condition check those, and looking for gaps as well. So when we're talking about kind of time, loans particularly, you know, you want to be identifying those gaps kind of relatively early, because of the deadlines for loans can be 6 months, a year, sometimes in advance. With kind of an interpretation strategy complete, you then want to be thinking about who can help you build that vision, who can help you present it. So a lot of that is creating briefs for people like exhibition designers, for build contractors, for graphic designers. And again, kind of almost working through a very similar process with them, coming up with a concept, coming up with a slightly more detailed design, getting that signed off, getting feedback from your team, getting feedback from your audience on those things, before you're at a stage where you can actually have a technical design in front of you you can give to a build contractor. There's then a lot of kind of work just in terms of organising transport. There's a lot of so the kind of slightly more boring kind of health and safety, contractor management paperwork that you've got to do to ensure that everything's safe and secure. Before doing the actual fun bit, the installation. And I would say my my top tip, and this is something that I've forgotten more than once, is that exhibitions actually have to come down and objects have to go back. So to remember to actually plan in that as well as part of your process.
Yes, the return, which I'm sure Amy's had a huge amount of experience with, as you were saying before, but the return is definitely something to plan as well. I'd just like to pull out a question, because we talked, I think, Polly, you kind of talked about sort of assets in your discussion, but I wanted to sort of kind of broaden that out and talk about co-curation a little bit and how important that is in some of the exhibition work that we do. And I wondered if you'd like to come in on that, Alice.
Yeah, so we've co-curated quite a few things in my time now, most notably the kind of, we have this large project ongoing called the Bradford National Museum project, and that basically was about us becoming a museum well, obviously a national museum, but in a very local context in Bradford. So really about making ourselves a city more for the people of Bradford. That's where the core of our audience comes from, and working with people in Bradford to kind of reflect that. And we produced a show, it feels like 10 years ago now, but I think it was a year ago. I think there's some members of my team in this chat now, actually, and they're probably going, you can't even remember when it was. I think it was last March. And yeah, we co-curated that with about 150 different participants from around Bradford City region. And I think on that, and it kind of, we follow a really similar pattern to how Jamie just described the kind of REBA stages. And I think when you're co-curating, the key really, even when you're not co-curating with external partners, is constant communication to really enable that collaboration, so it doesn't feel like you're just taking something and then running away, burrowing off, doing part of the work and then showing your co-curators something that they really don't feel like they've played a part in. And that can be really time consuming, obviously, and really difficult, and there will be more back and forth. And there were times actually when we'd go to some of our co-curators, and I remember one of the key collaborators was the head of the local radio station, and she said to me one day, "Why do you keep asking me my opinions on design? I don't know about design, that's your job." And I said, she's a really good friend, and I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mary, you can just say you don't want to come to the meetings if you want." And it's kind of because she thought I was expecting something from her, and equally I didn't want to hide something from her as a partner. So we really needed to have enough time in that process to have all those little conversations, those moments of, "Oh, let us just adjust that. That's not working for you. We'll par back." But the worst thing I think can happen in co-curation is, which I've witnessed and I've kind of seen take part, is when you co-curate and you work in partnership, and then you get to a point where the museum kind of says, "We'll take it from here," and then you walk away with it and your partners see something that they feel like they've not actually played much of a part in when they see, the final product, as it were. So I think even when you're not externally working with partners, communication is absolutely key to all collaborative endeavours, because we collaborate internally as well with other teams. Exhibitions have to work with about 15 different teams on any given show. But I'd say giving yourself, and often it's not us deciding this, but if you can claw some time in your project and they're not asking for it in 5 minutes, I think that's really crucial to co-curation, so that you're on a kind of even playing field with who you're working with, and you own up to what you don't know as well. Because I think that was the really interesting thing about that project. I ended up having a lot of conversations out of hours, because I live in Bradford as well, with people going, "Oh, well, this and that about the museum." And I was going, "I feel like that too." And I became a person to them rather than a figurehead of the museum. And that takes a lot of time and effort that hopefully you can work out in your allotted working time, and not sometimes down the pub on a Friday night, but it happens.
I think some of the best ideas sometimes happen, I find, in the supermarket when I see people, and I end up having quite a long discussion about something that is, well, I've got a tray full of, bread or whatever. Polly, did you have something to come in on about co-curation as well, kind of building on your point before?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have huge experience of it. I did a community project that was built for and by the community and with them, but it wasn't really co-curation, because we kind of had the overall plan for the exhibition, and then we invited members of the community to participate with artists on kind of different projects. But I have recently been involved in what's been described as a co-design project, was in actual fact more co-curation in principle, but I think did exactly what Alice was saying, and I'm not going to say who the client was, where really it was a finite number of sessions. It was 6 sessions, so it's quite a lot with a group of young people, but at the end of the day, the client, who's the museum, have said, "Well, that's great, thanks for your input," and off they scurry. But I think so really what it became was more of a kind of elaborate form of audience consultation, which is still really valid, and it did mean that we had a specific target audience, which was young people from 18 to 24, who we worked with on a sustained basis, and kept checking in with them every kind of month or so along the process. But yeah, it's not proper co-curation, which I think is a very different beast.
If I could add something just really quickly, I think what's just come to mind then actually is what was really significant is wanting to break down this idea that as an external partner working with the museum shouldn't feel like a privilege. And I think quite often it comes with this, "We've invited you to come and work with us at the museum" kind of tone sometimes with some projects. And something that we really learned through Bradford's National Museum project was that we weren't aware of some of the things that the museum could do for partners, and it wasn't sometimes exhibiting work, or sometimes they didn't want to help us write the interpretation. What they needed was some studio space or some advice on something else. They had no interest of showing their work at this museum in particular, but they wanted us to help broker something, and we had skills to do that. And I think making sure that you don't treat it as much as you can as a hierarchical situation, I think the better, because it has to be co-curation, not just "you can come do this and we're giving you something," because that never gets off to a good start.
Yeah, definitely. I think you expressed that idea of moving away from transactional engagement with communities is yeah, important. So we're just going to move on now to a few questions about kind of getting started in your career, and then we're going to come back to some more fun exhibition content questions. But we've had a number of people get in touch about how you get started in a career in exhibitions. And I wondered whether you had anything to add to that as members of the panel, but also whether it was something that you even thought of at the beginning of your career. And I don't know if you'd like to come to that, Jamie, to begin with.
Yeah, for sure. So doing exhibitions, I think it was something I wanted to do quite early in my career. I initially wanted to work in the education side of things, but I was involved in a couple of exhibition installs early on in my career when I worked front of house, and I just really liked the practical aspect of it. It wasn't necessarily kind of the interpretation side or the creative side of it. I just had a really good good time moving dinosaurs and stuffed seals around and things like that, you know. And I think I got into it really in a slightly kind of odd way, in that I got my first job in exhibitions actually off the strength of my administration background rather than my kind of creative background. So I went from a job working in a small kind of local museum planning weddings to working in a local museum planning exhibitions. And it was actually that kind of that administration side of it, that ability to put together a budget, to put together a schedule, to put together staff, to delegate tasks, to sort of take responsibility for things. They were the skills that actually got me the job, rather than the actual experience of doing exhibitions or writing labels or working with museum objects.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Yeah, admin is key. Amy, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the admin and logistics skills are really key. I've been working in museums sort of about 11 years, and actually started in collections management. So my first job was at the National Maritime Museum doing mostly collection audits. But that kind of job, what it's good for is you get a really good grounding in object handling and kind of working with different types of objects, different types of collections, and gaining kind of the skills, just kind of knowing, you know, what different types of collections need in terms of storage and in terms of what, you know, what they might need for an exhibition. So I was in collections management for probably about 8 years. I then moved on to the Horniman Museum as a documentation officer, which sounds really boring, but it was, again, a lot of object handling. I was dealing there with all their new acquisitions, and they acquire a lot there. I mean, they have every quarter of the year they acquire like tons of stuff. So again, I was getting really good exposure to objects and all their stories. And then through that, kind of went down the registrarial route by doing all the new acquisitions, working on disposals as well. So I wasn't really working on exhibitions at all at that point, but just kind of around the process and kind of seeing what was going on, and kind of thought, yeah, I quite like that side. And then got the job at the Courtauld as an assistant registrar, where kind of, because it's such a small team, I mean, the gallery team in total is about 15 staff, and that's including conservators, curators, and registrars. Because it's so small, it actually means that you get experience in so many different things in your job. So through that, I then have progressed to the registrar of exhibitions and projects there. So it's kind of a roundabout way of getting to exhibitions, but probably that's the way that a lot of people get into it. There's probably not one direct route necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. Polly, how have you come to be in this field?
Yeah, I've had a complete spiral of a journey getting to it. Didn't know that even there was a role called interpretation till I probably was about 13 years into my career. So having done theatre and film design, I started volunteering on this community exhibition, and I basically signed myself up to be the designer on it. Ended up being the deputy director of it, where I was just doing everything from fundraising to managing up to the board, to designing exhibits, to kind of showing members of the public round. And then from there, in parallel to that, I was doing a PhD, which did involve quite a lot of object handling and a lot of interviewing and a lot of listening to people. I was doing it in sub-Saharan Africa, and had to basically sit in the desert asking people questions and like listening really hard. And then when I got my PhD, knew I didn't want to do anything kind of academic. So I was just thinking, well, what the hell am I going to do? And a friend of mine said, oh, he was working for a design consultancy, Ralph Applebaum, who are really big, do loads of master planning, loads of projects. He said, there's this job called interpretation, you know, come and talk to someone who does it. I'm sure they'd be interested in you. And I literally had lunch with someone, and they hired me the next day as the writer on a they were tendering for a big project. And I would just go into the toilet like in my break and laugh at myself in the mirror that being employed as a writer. I had like, you know, no experience of writing professionally. But basically I had to kind of describe the vision for them so that they can kind of put it in this document. And I realized that I was quite good at articulating other people's ideas and kind of coming up with ideas was definitely something I liked doing. I just wasn't very good at designing, which is why I didn't want to see that through. So I ended up working for them for 5 years and became their senior interpretation manager, worked on massive redevelopment project for the Exeter City Museum RAM, and kind of moved on from there. So yeah, it was just one of those weird routes where I never really felt happy in the careers I was working in. I always knew that I loved museums, but everyone I met in museums just tried to put me off working in museums, saying it was a really torturous process and took too long to make any decisions. But yeah, I've never looked back. Having kind of landed in museums, it feels definitely the right place for me. And it's not just museums, it's, you know, heritage sites, you name it. It's kind of creating stories in all sorts of places. So yeah.
Thanks, Polly. And Alice, because I know you said you'd kind of moved.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting one for me, because I think so much of when people ask me kind of how do I get started or how do I get in, I actually think so much of this rests on the recruiter and the recruitment process itself, as well as the individual who might be applying. Because I look at the team I work in, and a lot of us were hired by the same manager who really had a bit of a, I guess, he knew what he wanted in the team, and they were kind of skills based rather than certain experiences. So not many of us had worked in museums before. We'd worked in shops. One of us had worked in a zoo. I'd come from an opera company, but what he was looking for what the team needed was project management and interpretation. And not every team is set up like this, obviously, but the interpretation kind of stuff, I'd been an artist producer, and they were really looking for that at the time. And so I was lucky that at that moment, that was the kind of mindset of the team, I suppose, because I think without changing the way we recruit and all these kinds of, you need 1 million hours volunteering, or you need this or that, how do you have a chance, really? Because I know it's been spoken about at the conference about imposter syndrome, and there can't be much worse in an industry that's so competitive, and I hadn't even worked in it before. Do you know what I mean? But I guess what I'd say is try and really carve out what part of the museum, and even if it's exhibitions, what part of the exhibitions team it is that you want to work in. Because the more I'd definitely say, obviously, keep an open mind and don't be like, I must be the curator of film and nothing else, because you might be waiting a long time for that job to come up, you know. But if it's the museum in general, if it's interpretation, really hone that skill and get some understanding in that. And I mean, because I'm not an advocate for unpaid work at all, like quite the opposite, obviously. But I do think making sure you know what part of it is that you want to go into can sometimes help. just to, because because I'm in the same place until the job didn't exist when I started at the museum. I started as creative producer, and then this new job came up, and I was like, we have interpretation developers, and they were called content developers. And when we talk to people, they go, oh, what do you write the labels? And we go, and we produce the AV, and we commission artists, and we do this and we do that. So I think it's about finding people who will be willing to talk to you about these roles, because previously I would never have applied to the museum. I liked the job description of creative producer. If I'd seen interpretation, I would have gone, not for me. And I mean, I'll say this now and I might live to regret it, but like, my emails are open if people want to ask what's that job like in more detail, because I know I could have benefited from talking to someone about what it's actually like day to day, because you'll have more skills than you know. And it's like Jamie said, from working in planning weddings, if you've worked in a shop, or if you've worked in different form of project management, you've got all these transferable skills, and you should be able to do that work and make it, be able to use that in an interview or an application to say, I think I can use this to do that, what you're explaining, without the need for all of these requirements that we all know shouldn't be on the job descriptions anymore.
I think the only thing I can say is preach, Alice, like, for sure. 100% agree. I am going to ask this question because we had a lot of people submit it, because they'd noticed that there weren't opportunities for volunteering, particularly in exhibitions, and there weren't assistant exhibition or assistant roles. How do you make that move, whether you've started in maybe a front of house job or in a different job, and what can you do to try and make it more explicit that you want to make that move? Jamie, would you like to jump in on that?
Well, I think in terms of the way that I certainly got that very kind of early exhibition experience of moving dinosaurs and stuffed seals around was as part of my PDP, so flagging it up as part of my kind of, is it like annual reviews, 6-month reviews, things like that. And I was lucky in the respect that I had a supportive manager. We were a small team, so actually kind of a lot of that was really kind of welcome. I think again at Tunbridge Wells there were people who moved from front of house into doing exhibitions. So for example, a colleague identified that as part of her professional development, and I actually mentored that process of finding a mentor. I think is potentially something really useful. This is not a route that I took, but it is a route that she took, was doing the AMA, and actually kind of identifying that as part of her AMA work as well, getting into exhibitions. In my experience though, I would say it's been, working at a bigger kind of institution like the Railway Museum, it is more difficult to do that. I've only really come across it kind of once, but it is looking for that kind of those transferable skills, and you don't have to necessarily work on a big huge exhibition to get those transferable skills. So I think about the colleague I worked with at the National Railway Museum who just did some I think it was like a couple of case displays, and it's something that you can build on. It's something that you can use in job applications. And I think other people have said, it's transferable skills are so valuable. Those project management skills, those just things like being able to kind of look after and manage money is really important. Being able to organize people, being able to take responsibility for people. But I think certainly with interpretation, some of those writing skills, you can get some of those skills doing kind of things that you love in your spare time. So I really would look for some of those skills in some of those kind of things that you love doing anyway, outside of museums as well.
Thanks, Jamie. Alice, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
I'd echo what Jamie said, definitely, about, again, I know the word of the day, transferable skills, but also, I think if you're, is this about if people are kind of already in a role, maybe a front of house role specifically, or could it be more general than that?
We had questions about coming from both aspects, so people just starting out fresh or people who are wanting to progress, so either way.
Yeah, I think I'd definitely recommend either finding a mentor, and even if it's not kind of formal, finding kind of an ally who might be able to kind of keep having those conversations with you, who will, have a cup of coffee with you, have a chat, answer, take you around the shows, answer questions about how it, came to be, because they can be quite daunting things to look at when they're just kind of produced and finalized. I think there's a fine line though, isn't there, of not wanting to, I know in our team, especially, not wanting to kind of take advantage of people wanting to kind of help to get experience. And we have to, it's a really careful line, because you want to give everyone all the experience in the world, but they're paid roles for a reason. And we don't want to exploit the fact that some people will and some people won't be able to give up that time. I do think there do need to be more roles like assistant level roles, absolutely, and more entry level roles I definitely advocate for. And if you can find one, I mean, obviously go right for it, but that's why they're so competitive, because they're so few and far between. It's something that I think about quite a lot in terms of in that respect. But then I'd also not doubt yourself if you see something that isn't entry level. Just go even if it's not an assistant role, if it is, if it is project manager and you haven't project managed an exhibition, but you think, you've got every other skill to do it, why not still go for it? And then ask for really constructive feedback if you're not successful in getting that role. Don't underestimate what you might be able to do. It might not, you might be further ahead than you believe. And I know it's hard to believe in yourself in such a competitive market, but in my experience, 9 times out of 10 people are lovely enough to, give you a ring and say why you might not have got the role over someone else, or some advice on maybe some elements that are missing in your experience, kind of in lieu of, I don't want to say just wait for a early career role to come up. I'm saying just apply to be the director and then ask why you didn't get it, because you're never going to know otherwise, and it might rock the boat a little bit too at the same time.
Yeah, I'm definitely an advocate for taking a punt, definitely. One of the questions that's come through on the chat is about how exhibitions have changed in response to the pandemic. So I'd like to come back to you, Amy, if you can tell us a bit more about kind of like, how did you first feel, to be honest, and then how did things pan out?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic has really thrown a lot of questions up for exhibitions. In particular, things like couriers. So a lot of institutions will send a courier with an artwork. At the Courtauld, we mostly do always send someone. Clearly, when there's a pandemic and there's no travel around the entire world, that's been a real problem for museums globally. Yeah, when it hit, obviously, and the unknown length of it all, it was very difficult to know what to do. I mean, when we had all these artworks in Japan, we obviously thought that the Kobe venue would open, and then of course it didn't, and it was really sad actually that never happened. But also, it was really difficult to know what to do. Do you leave them there and hope that the situation gets better? I mean, I'm talking like, we got them back in July, so the decisions were being made really from like May onwards, and of course we were like deep in lockdown at that point, had no end in sight, but then you still thought by kind of the end of the year we'd be out of this, and clearly that's not happened. But at the time we were thinking, well, maybe we should delay until like August, because surely it will be better by August and we'll be able to send people to Japan. And so it was really hard to know, like, what is the right decision to make? Do you leave them sitting on a wall in the middle of Japan, closed? Do you move them to a warehouse in Japan for an unknown length of time? Or do you actually just try and get them back as soon as possible? Which is what we decided, because it was so unknown. But even that had its complications, because all the transport agents had furloughed like 90% of their staff. So during lockdown, pretty much it was impossible to transport anyway. The flights were obviously most flights were cancelled during lockdown, especially kind of the freight flights were, if not fully cancelled, but drastically reduced. So it was actually quite difficult to arrange all things like that. Stuff that you would never think would happen obviously did happen. I think now, since the pandemic, museums will rethink whether a courier is necessary for every single loan. I know that the American, I think it's the American Registrars group, have drafted a kind of document about couriers and about what will happen in the future. I know that the UK government indemnity during the lockdown kind of gave advice to people and have said that they will kind of ensure works even if we can't have a courier, and there'll be other international indemnity schemes that will be kind of maybe reviewing the need for couriers, or whether a virtual courier is kind of the same. Yeah, it's thrown up a lot of issues that I think will take a long time to kind of fully work through. Yeah, and I just wanted to say one thing about the last question. There is the UK Registrars group is a really good place, actually, if you can join as a member. And when I was at the Horniman and kind of doing documentation, not really that much to do with exhibitions or really that much registrarial work, I joined, and it's a really great place to network because you can meet other registrars, other people in exhibitions, transport agents who are also really great people to know. You can also kind of go down that route as well. You can work within exhibitions for a transport agent. But I just wanted to say that the UK Registrars group is a really good resource, and I'd recommend kind of joining, and they do lots of events and things.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Registrars group. They also, I think, still run a traineeship. Is that correct?
They might do. I'm not entirely sure, but they might. They definitely offer support and stuff. There used to be a program, was it in Leeds, where they did?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's in Leeds.
I think there certainly has been a trainee this year. You would want to go and check if there was going to be one next year. But they have advice and support for people there. Thinking about how the pandemic has affected people who are freelancing, Polly, I wondered if you could kind of come in there as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, initially, a big contract I had just disappeared out of the window because I was at the third stage in a job where we created an interpretation strategy on our project, and it was actually for Salisbury Cathedral, and the next stage was for them to test it with visitors and non-visitors and see what their response was. So I mean, the combination of basically not being able to do things with visitors because they had to shut the space, but also they got bigger fish to fry about keeping financially afloat, just meant the cards were off the table in terms of the interpretation strategy. I mean, I have been really lucky in that other projects have carried on going. I had a convenient gap where another project got postponed because all the staff on the project got furloughed. So yeah, keeping yourself going has been as tough as it has for the rest of people. But I think also in terms of the kind of key change for me, I facilitate lots of workshops. So suddenly facilitating those workshops online has been a massive learning curve. It's like, how do you, normally I'll go into a workshop and I use a lot of kind of pieces of paper stuck on the wall and constantly taking notes and kind of doing diagrams with post-it notes on the table or on the walls. So yeah, there are programs to be able to do that, but it's not the same, but it's, and it's hard to kind of split people into chat rooms when you can't kind of float between them. I'm not brilliant at all of that, but I'm learning, and I think it's just been one of the things I've had to do really. But I think the other key difference is that a lot of attention now has been on just removing anything tactile, which has meant that you're removing anything that facilitates access for people who otherwise might not be able to access your stories and your assets. So yeah, a lot of my work has been trying to stop clients from just cutting anything that actually makes the exhibition more accessible. you know, because actually there's got to be ways of accommodating it and facilitating tactility so people can still have it. But I mean, in the early days of the pandemic, you know, there was so much unknown, and now like more research is kind of evidenced about kind of cleaning things properly and facilitating kind of the touching of objects. It's you've got a stronger case to kind of be putting things back in or arguing for them to be put back in. So yeah, quite a lot of changes all around, really.
Thanks so much, Polly. I have just become dramatically aware of time because I was so interested. So I've got a couple more questions to finish on. And this, the first one, is kind of what happens when an exhibition you work on ends up with negative reviews, or the audience doesn't like it, or it's just not popular. Like, how do you respond to that as someone who's so involved in the project? And Jamie, would you be okay to come in?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I've got some very practical kind of, or very relevant experience of that happening with the DLI gallery that I worked on. Oh God, it's awful. I've actually got a book which I took of all the negative comments which came in, and it was like nothing I've ever experienced before, because there was so much negative feeling towards the gallery because of the previous museum closing, and you know, words like shameful, people would be turning in their graves, a disgrace to the regiment, you know, really, really negative comments. But I think the thing that the thing certainly that I had to do was to actually just be aware of the context that these comments were coming in, and it was difficult, but actually disassociating myself from a lot of the negative feeling, which, you know, I knew wasn't actually directed at, you know, me as the curator, or, you know, my team as the people that have put the exhibition together. It's the situation, and that was initially difficult because it was a challenging exhibition to work on, but we'd all kind of done our best. I think it was also challenging as well because obviously we do want to respond to those comments as well. We want to you know, make kind of changes so the exhibition is better. So I think as part of that, we did actually do our own evaluation to try and kind of separate that negativity to actually things that were wrong with it. But for me, the really positive thing was actually, it was probably about a year later when I'd actually left and moved on to another job. And I actually, just out of curiosity, went back to look at the, what are they called? Trip Finder reviews. And it was those people who had nothing to do with the regiment, who had nothing to do with the situation at all, who just actually come to visit the exhibition, you know, as an exhibition, and took it as its kind of face value. The comments there were completely different, so much more positive, and so much more kind of appreciative, and you know, a lot of the things we wanted to get across, we could see get across there. So yeah, it is difficult because it can feel personal. So I think it's about seeing the context in which those comments are made, and having that clarity to sort the positive from the just downright mean, which, you know, you should do your best to ignore, really.
Thanks so much, Jamie. I'm going to kind of move the question slightly. Thanks for your experience. And move on to another related one. What do you do if the stories that you want to tell aren't in your collection? So kind of if you're light on objects but strong on the story, kind of what do you do then? And I guess there's questions about loans, but also questions about interpretation there. So if I can come to Amy quickly to kind of start that off.
I mean, I don't have so much experience of that at the Courtauld, incoming exhibitions at the Courtauld, but I'm currently working on an outgoing national UK touring exhibition. The Courtauld has a really nice collection of Islamic metalwork, kind of randomly, but it's really beautiful. So we're lending 10 items to 4 venues in the UK. Each of those venues kind of had to apply for the process to have those objects, and each venue can kind of create an exhibition completely autonomously. We're not really involved with the interpretation, it's up to them. But some of those venues, in particular the Royal Cornwall Museum, which was the first venue it went to, which was last September, they have a very small, tiny collection of Islamic metalwork, but they wanted to have this exhibition exactly because they didn't have that type of collection, and because it's not necessarily seen in Cornwall, and they were able to then weave it into their own stories and engage kind of different audiences and different communities that they wouldn't normally be able to do. So that's the kind of experience I have, where we have been able to lend out kind of these particular objects, and then each venue is kind of using them in their own completely different way. And funnily enough, we lent to Cartwright Hall Art Gallery in Bradford, and it was an amazing, they were a brilliant partner. Like, I loved working with them, and it actually got stuck there in lockdown, and they looked after the stuff really, really well. But again, they do have a collection of Islamic metalwork, but again, they used it to kind of broaden their story and everything.
Thanks so much, Amy. And Alice, would you be able to come in on the telling stories?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one for interpretation, and some people will definitely disagree with me, and maybe more in the curatorial side of my museum. But sometimes you do exhibitions because you want to tell stories about the objects, and other times you do an exhibition because you want to tell a story and the objects help illustrate that story. So there are kind of two ways that you approach it sometimes. So we've got a strand of exhibitions that in-house we call hot topics, and they're extremely light object-wise. So we did one about fake news, and we did one about internet-connected devices most recently, and about the fact that we're living with more internet-connected devices than human beings. Now, we don't have many objects that speak to fake news. We had a couple of things like the Cottingley fairies, really brilliant objects, but rather than trying to cram it, we knew that story was one that we wanted to tell, and one that we wanted to have a conversation with our visitors about. And the fact that it was object light actually was okay, because we went into the interpretation very much to have a conversation with our audience, to say, look, this isn't necessarily a major part of our collection, but we think it's relevant to our remit. What do you think? Let's have a conversation. We used other things like AV. We commissioned artworks for the more recent show, Never Alone. So you can think of other ways. If there's a pressing story to tell that's relevant to your remit, don't let the fact that you haven't got objects kind of deter you from doing that. I think if you've got the interest and the skill, and you think your audience are going to respond positively to that, I think you can still make a really brilliant show that allows conversation with visitors.
Thanks so much, Alice. And sadly, we're coming to a close now. So I'm just going to ask each of our panel members to give us one top tip, either something they wish they'd known about before they got into exhibitions, or a top tip for getting into the sector. And if we start with Polly, that'd be great.
I think someone said it earlier, but I think it's finding out what the different roles are first. And again, if anyone wants to email me, I'd be happy for anyone to ask a bit more about what interpretation is, because it took me, as I said before, a good 14 years to discover interpretation existed as a role. So yeah, that would be my top tip.
And Amy?
I agree with that. Yeah, there's so many different roles. Kind of think about what you want to do. Try and network as much as you can. I've tried that with the UK Registrars group. And again, I'm also happy for anyone to email.
And Jamie?
Yes, I think I would just kind of echo a lot of the things that people have already said, and just say, stay curious and be comfortable being curious. Ask questions and be comfortable not knowing everything. Of course, if anybody would like to email me as well, my emails are also open.
Thanks. If people who've offered their emails could pop them in the chat box, that would be great if they're happy to do that. And Alice, what's your final top tip? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, really not very different. Definitely keep asking questions. And finally, just don't underestimate yourself. I think you've everyone's got far more to offer than we give ourselves credit for. So just tap into that, and yeah, and email me if you'd like to as well. I'll pop mine in now.
So I'd just like to say a big thank you to the panel. I've learned loads. I hope everyone in the audience has. We are on quite sort of tight time, so I'd really encourage people to get those email addresses now. You can also email fairmuseumjobs@gmail.com, and we can put you through to a speaker if you'd like as well. And thank you once again for your time, everybody. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Amy. And thank you, Polly. The session was recorded, so we're hoping to make it available afterwards, but that might not be for a little bit of time because we will be tired. Enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.